Okay. This is a layman's discussion on this topic, tithe, which is T-I-T-H-E, which is the concept of giving 10% of your income to the church. And people are often confused as to what it means. Should it be given? And what's the difference between that and alms giving, or who has the right over the tithe? And so the best thing to do is look at what tithe is. Based on the scriptures, both old and new, is referring to 10% of your produce in any of your labor or career. So if you are a physician, it will be 10% of your gross income. If you're a farmer, it's the 10% of your produce. If you're a dry cleaner, it may mean 10% of your income, or 10% of your skill, which means you can give God 10% of your skill if you don't make any money. Where do we find these informations? If you look at Leviticus 27:30, Leviticus 27 verse 30, it says, all tithes of the land is the Lord's, so it belongs to God. So 10% of your gross income in whatever job or career that you have will belong to God. The famous one people usually quote is Malachi 3 verse 10. Malachi 3 verse 10, where he says that God accuses us of robbing him. And then when we say, how do we rob him? He tells us because we are not bringing the tithe to his house. And what is his house? The church, the temple, the synagogue. And he says, why don't you do it and see if I will not open the floodgate of heavens and pour so much blessing upon your household that it will not even contain my blessing. So he simply said, bring food to my house or to my store and see if I will not bless you tremendously. Then we also look at Luke chapter 11, verse 42, and Matthew 23, verse 23, where Jesus accuses the Pharisees of not actually worrying about the people that pay the tithe. So he says you should first worry about love and justice before you talk about the tithe. And so if we put these things together, who is the rightful owner of the tithe, and how often is tithe actually held in the Old Testament? It's every 7th year. It's not every Sunday. It's every 7th year in the Old Testament. And if Jesus says you should talk about love and justice first, one can look at Acts chapter 5 to see the difference between offering, tithe, as well as almsgiving. If your heart is in the Lord and your heart is in the people who are your brothers and sisters that make up the church, you should be concerned about their well-being. Therefore, you will spend a lot of your money taking care of their needs first before you even come to question of tithe. And so whatever is left, even if you bring 10% of whatever is left, I don't think it's going to bother God. Not thinking, because that's what he says. Worry about love and justice first. So when I look at Acts chapter 5, I will see that members of the early church sold their houses because they had everything in common. And they brought the money and laid the money at the apostles' feet. The apostles would divide the money among the congregation according to their needs, not according to who they liked. And the apostles didn't take the money for themselves. So when tithe is paid today, and the pastors who would take the tithes home, buy Mercedes, build big houses, buy 2 million airplanes for themselves, make their wives this second in command in the church, and their son the assistant pastor. So when he dies, the son takes over and becomes the pastor. And we collect this 10%. It doesn't belong to the pastor nor the priest. It belongs to God. And if it belongs to God, then it should be used for God's services only. The priest gets paid his salary because the laborer deserves his wages. But you should start by how much was Jesus paid. How many houses did he have? How many airplanes? How many boats? How many wives? How many children? Because if you focus your service on serving God, according to Paul's teaching, says if you're not married, he advises to be single. Because if you're single, you will spend most of your time worrying about affairs of God and the church. So if you're already a married pastor with your children, obviously, according to St. Paul, you're going to spend most of your time focusing on worrying about the affairs of your wife and your children. And so when the tithe comes, what do you do with the tithe? It's not your possession. It belongs to the church. And it belongs to the strangers. So in the Old Testament, when God selects a place for the tithe to take place, people will bring the 10% of their produce and bring it to this location, and whoever was in need would take whatever he wanted, because it belongs to the Lord and not to the pastor. So if I keep tithing 10% of my income, and the pastor is buying Mercedes and building houses and buying airplanes like these people you see all around the world who call themselves pastors, while their congregation and their members are starving to death, they will collect their money, build schools and universities, and these members will not afford to send their kids to these same schools and universities. Either this is not houses of God, this is purely a business, and those who are believing that they are going to be blessed because they bring the 10%, according to Malachi, to the church, which we call the storage or the storehouse of God. No, it's not the storehouse of God, because God does not deal with anything that is abominable or sinful. If you receive the tithe is meant to be used to take care of people of God. It's not meant for the pastor. Though the pastor gets paid his salary because the laborer deserves his wage. So for anyone who is bringing 10% of his income to someone, usually to buy Mercedes, he's just making himself feel good, because that is not your ticket to blessing, nor your ticket to heaven. And this is the simple truth.